Welcome to the Green Team sponsored program, The Farmer and the Chef. Today's program is being broadcast on channel 973. It will be recorded and rebroadcast at a later date and be part of the GHA video library on Touchtown. We are to a great extent the result of what we eat. And the food we eat is to a great extent determined by the choices that the farmer, the ranchers, and the food processors make. These choices taken together are having a great impact on our health and the health of our environment. We begin today with the celebration of Earth Day with a discussion of these important choices by Mr. Greg Glenn, owner of Rocklands Farm and Winery, and Brian Patterson, the innovative chef of Good Living. So, gentlemen, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Let you tell the people who you are and what you're doing. And at the end, please leave a few minutes for questions. So, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Carroll, one of my heroes here at Goodwin Living. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and it is even more of a pleasure to be here with my, I could say old friend, I think at this point, Greg Glenn. The question that was asked first was, why Greg Glenn? How do I know him? You kind of know what my scoop is. Maybe you can tell me a little more about what I do here than I do. But when I was teaching at l'Académie de Cuisine, I had my first year, my phase one professional students, and we were learning how to break down chickens and cut carrots and all these things. And their sole exposure to where these foods came from was the back door or the grocery store. And that was kind of the limit of their universe, was where the origin of the food they were cooking and handling it began and ended. And it seemed a no-brainer, an imperative to me as their instructor to say, look, there's more to the story of where these foods are coming from, and the better acquainted you are with the origin story of your foods, the more informed a chef you will be, and perhaps more of a sensitivity you'll have and reverence you'll have for your ingredients as you cook them. That these aren't just commodities, these aren't just things that we use to feed people and make plates look pretty, that they are in fact critical elements to our nourishment and our ecological survival. So we just struck up a relationship. I would bring my students out on field trips to Rocklands Farm, and Greg Glenn would give them just the most phenomenal tour. That was not only there's a critter, there's a critter, there's a critter. I mean, that's always impressive. You'll hold a chicken and there's a pig wallowing, and we were all amazed at that. But he also inculcated a sense of reverence of land stewardship. And I don't want to get too far ahead of his story, but we developed a relationship where we supported each other in our endeavors. So he supported me as a chef and my knowledge and understanding of the food and where it comes from and what that story is and what role that plays in our overall existence. And I supported him by being sort of the chef voice of the farmer, saying, look at this magnificent quality of food. Probably the best thing I can do is get out of the way of the quality of this food. Do as little to it as possible to reveal how great it is without a lot of manipulation, without a lot of construction or deconstruction. And we've taken this show, we've spoken before in various different venues. It's been a while. COVID put kind of a kibosh on our connection, but I was very honored when Greg reached out to me and said, we got to take our show back on the road again. So this is the Sunshine Boys bringing their show back to you, back on the road, and I told him that I would perform the same in reciprocity, and we'd come out to the farm and and do the same sort of thing in support of Rockland's Farm and in support of his efforts. So without any further ado, you know, you've heard me enough, I want to pass the mic to Greg, and then we're going to kind of just have a tete-a-tete and do what we do as far as prompting each other on the things that, the sensibilities that a chef brings to the farm and the sensibilities that the farmer brings to the chef. I think it's very revealing. So with that.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if my mic will pick up or not. I might go handheld, if that's okay.
Yeah. And we're very casual. We're not, this isn't going to be a stiff thing.
Yeah.
We're going to wander around a little bit. So.
Yeah, so my name is Greg Glenn. I am running Rockland's Farm Winery out in Poolesville, Maryland. If you're not familiar with the area, Dulles Airport, it's about 45 minutes west of here. We're right across the river. The airplanes fly right over our farm to land at Dulles. I grew up in the area for the most of my life since 1992. My family moved out to the Rocklands property in 2003. At the time, it was a beautiful, historic, rundown property. It was not a functional business, but it had a lot of great bones and had a really wonderful legacy in the area. In 2010 is when I came back from college, and my friend Sean and I started the business Rocklands. And at that time, we were doing produce, some livestock, and as well as some engagement or tours. And within a few years, people really enjoyed coming out to Rocklands, and there was more to it than just engaging with us and engaging with our products. They wanted to stay, they wanted to immerse, they wanted to be refreshed and renewed there. And so within 2 or 3 years of the start, we started making some wine just to see how it went. I started serving hamburgers to show people the beef that I was raising in my cattle. And people really enjoyed that. So pretty quickly on at the beginning of our business, it turned into this destination property. So a lot of people come out on the weekends, they'll have a glass of wine, we'll have some food trucks out there. We're selling our meats on site. My wife has beautiful flowers that she does at the farm as well. So our origin story is very much of an organic growth. We have a great location. We love what we do. It's a beautiful place. And so for a lot of our customers, it's just a place of blessing for them to come out. Most people know us as a winery. So if you've heard of Rocklands before, you would know us as a winery. But we are doing quite a bit of regenerative land management, raising livestock. Since COVID, we are now restarting our education program. So we get a lot of young people, field trips, farm camp, things like that coming out to the property because we're so close to the DC metropolitan area. We're very accessible. And it's really important to us to connect, especially young people, to where food comes from. So that's a little bit about our origin story. Our mission as a business is to feed, nourish, and engage. We feed by creating a physical product for people to consume and to enjoy. We nourish them by the quality of that product and the quality of their experience with us, with the place. And then we engage, we connect people with where their food comes from. And that engaged part of our mission is really where Brian and I picked up. And I think the theme of today's talk is this idea of you are what you eat. I'll posit that you are what you eat eats. And I'll tell a couple anecdotes to that. And then our vision, the future that we're trying to create with our business is gathering people around a table to celebrate the heavenly feast, this feast of welcome, this feast of abundance, this feast of joy. And we as a business can provide the wine, the meats, the flowers as part of that meal, whether that's feasting at Rocklands or taking a feast home with you and reliving that with family and friends at home. And so that's our essence, that's our core center part of our business. Like I said, most people know us as a winery, so we're growing grapes, we're making wine. We also buy in grapes from within about 2 hours of here. We're selling all of that wine on site. Like I said, I'm managing a few hundred acres in the area to raise cattle and sheep for meat. And then my wife has a lovely flower garden where she does cut flowers for sale as well as for like weddings and events. Like I said, we're restarting our education, but those are the main kind of enterprises of our business would be the wine, the meats, the flowers, the education, and then some events like weddings at the farm. So yeah, so that's that's us in a nutshell and what we're doing. One of the loveliest things about getting to know Chef is his passion in crafting the meal. And he mentioned earlier on this idea of like stepping back as a chef. You think of a chef as high level of intellectual capacity, high level of skills to then he has it. But to manipulate the food, you're taking food and you're causing it to be something, and you're pushing food forward onto a plate. And I think there's some characteristics and some techniques that I've learned from him, where as a chef, you really kind of step back and you start with really good quality products. And they are the star of the show. You let them speak for themselves. And I've really appreciated that, because as a farmer or a land steward, that's our philosophy, is letting nature do the work versus forcing it. And most specifically in the winery, that's very much our core philosophy. The style of winemaking we do is quite rare in this region. It's low intervention winemaking, and it's very much that. It's letting the grape be the champion of the story in the glass. And as a winemaker, we're stepping back, we're not intervening, we're not manipulating it. And we believe that makes really delicious, interesting, compelling wine. So that's something I really appreciated from early on, meeting with you and your skills.
So, the last time we spoke, and many of you were in this group, when the last lecture that I gave on behalf of the Green Team, which was the impact of beef industry on the environment and on the climate, and how I think we can all agree that a lot of the modern practices of beef production is contrary to what's best for the planet, what's best for the soil, and even what's best for us. Some of like Greg was saying, rather than letting the cow be the cow, that we are almost reinventing this animal to serve our needs. We're inoculating them, we're growing them in an environment it's not their nature to live in. We're harvesting them, we're doing what it has become is a meat factory, rather than allowing the animal to be the animal, and the ground, the earth and environment in which it lives to have a symbiotic relationship with that animal. And as it turns out, what I've learned from Greg and from going to Rockland's Farm with my students is that really, really great beef and really, really great other animal proteins are a byproduct of really responsible, great land stewardship. So what I'd like to hear Greg talk a little bit more about is how he can go, he said earlier that Rocklands was kind of a worn out piece of land. And how do we take some of this land that's been abused or worn out and revitalize it, and as it turns out, grow really great wine and grow really great beef and chicken and eggs, but the higher priority, that's a byproduct of the intent.
Yeah.
So if you can talk a little bit about, and I know that you've actually gone and learned and consulted around the country on bigger scale land recovery processes, but talk a little bit about how really great food can be a byproduct of resuscitating a piece of land and managing land.
Certainly. And it's not just the food, it's the economic capacity, it's the social immersion, it's the family and the rural community. There's so many more threads that get woven together when you start talking about this concept of productive land stewardship, and it's really bringing together. But on the plate itself, you're getting this really high quality product, very nutrient dense, and you're supporting that in a way in the impact to the land that it produces. And like you were mentioning, the vast majority of the animal proteins that we're consuming come through the model where the animals have been taken out of their natural environment, their natural systems, and are commoditized And the pipeline of the food chain is such that there are really severe negative impacts ecologically, but not just macroecologically. There's also to the community that they're being produced in. And so what got us initially interested in this was this idea of biomimicry. Bio is life, mimicry to copy. So this concept of how can we replicate natural systems in our farming philosophy. And when you look to large grasslands, so cattle, sheep, chickens, you were farming them on grass, right? And we live in an area that was predominantly woodlands, historically, ecologically. But when you look to the real grasslands of the world and start looking about how these ecological systems fit together, there's some really interesting characteristics to that. So one is you have large herds of animals. So think of planet Earth, think of these documentaries of the Serengeti, things like that. You have these large herds of bison, buffalo, zebra, generally in a group. That group is typically moving across the landscape. And they are moving in such a way that we call that like a migration. So they're going to leave here and go there for quite a long time. And they won't come back here for a year or longer. Now what's causing them to be together in a group is the predator-prey relationship. Lions, hyenas, things like that are pushing them to stay together. They're moving because they eat what's available to them, but they're also moving because they're following the rains, and they're leaving this area, and they'll come back when the grass has regrown. And if you juxtapose that against the most fertile farmland around the world, it's coming from ecological grasslands. When you think of forests, rainforests, these really rich, abundant ecosystems, when you put them in the farming model, like slash and burn farming, you tear up the forest, you plant your crops, you use up all that available organic matter very quickly, and slash and burn has to move to the next part of the forest. Whereas you take places like the Midwest, the Great Plains, where we've been farming for 150 years, and we are depleting topsoil, but there's a lot of topsoil there to be depleted. And so it's typically these grasslands that have this really deep, rich soil that's been built because of this grassland system through biomimicry. Massive herds of bison moving across, being chased by Native Americans or wolves or whatnot, following the rains, and then they come back. So that cycle is our model. And so we replicate that on a much smaller scale. We don't have lions to manage our cattle. We have electric fence. The electric fence causes an artificial boundary which keeps them together in big groups. It also keeps them moving. We can move that wire so they're moving across the landscape. And we can keep a wire behind them as a back door so they're not coming back to where they were the day before. So we're using the philosophy and the model of nature to replicate into our system a form of land management with the byproduct being delicious, healthy meats. So.
What's one of the most amazing things I've seen on one of our field trips to Rocklands is and Greg said, oh, you're catching us on the perfect day. We're going to open a new field and close an old one. I was like, okay, that sounds great. And we get there, and he waits till we're all there, and sure enough, there's about, a 2-acre field full of clover and
orchard grass,
30 different flavors of grass. And then the field that they've been grazing on, which is pretty well shorn by now. And he just undoes this one low voltage wire, and the herd, takes one or two. It always takes, what do they say about leaders? The first one's a nut, the second one's like a follower, and then you got a movement, right? And so they make their way into this new field, and to steal his phrase, it's like kids in a candy store. These animals are going gonzo over a whole new range of flavors and varieties, and even some gravitate towards what their body tells them they need to eat more of. It's almost like a pharmacy as well as a grocery store to these cows, that they gravitate to the grasses they know they need for their sustenance. And to see them just get thrilled about grazing. And then the other part of the story is what happens then to that land that was just grazed. So it wasn't demolished, it's been used, it's been diminished, but now this is the opportunity. There's droppings, there's manure, but what happens with that? Manure is a new opportunity for fertilizer, but it can't just sit there in a clump. So then we have a whole other set of processes that come and happen to invigorate that land to be soil. And I want to dwell for a second on the meaning of soil. What is the difference between soil and dirt?
Yeah, so dirt is a four-letter word that we don't use at the farm. Dirt is something that the excavators work with. They push dirt around, right? But with a farmer, with the concept of reverence is soil is this precious thing. It's full of life. It's full of potential. And so we don't use the four-letter word of dirt. We do use soil.
And so what happens to that land that's not spent, but grazed? And so while your herd has moved to the next land site, now this site is beginning its recovery. And it's beginning to...
Yeah, so the term that we're using is a term that's called regenerative farming or regenerative ranching. And a really great visual that we use. So whenever we give any kind of tour, I love the perspective of a third grader. Now, it doesn't mean that we're dumbing down what we're doing. It means that we're inviting those of us who think we're mature to look at the world with a sense of like charm and joy, and let's bring our guard down a little bit, and let's just get introduced. But when you talk about regenerative farming to a third grader, it's like, well, what does that mean? Sustainability, all that. So we do a very simple exercise to help the young people remember the difference between sustainable, unsustainable, and regenerative. And I'll use you as an example. If you can put your arms out, side to side, like an airplane wing. So wiggle your left hand. Left hand would be, from my perspective, it would be yesterday. I guess from your perspective. So that's tomorrow. Wiggle your right hand, that's yesterday. So we have a little line graph here. Now, in an unsustainable system, the level of his arm would represent the amount of something, right? So we're on the y-axis. So a little bit of math. So in an unsustainable system, tip your hands in such a way that there's more of it yesterday than there is tomorrow. Tomorrow is down, yesterday is up. So our line graph in an unsustainable system, there's less of whatever it is tomorrow than there was yesterday. It could be water, it could be oil, it could be soil, it could be the potato chips in your bag, right? There's less of it as you unsustainably use it. Now bring him back to center. Center would be sustainable, so there's the same amount. We are sustaining that amount of that resource. And then regenerative would be what? Regenerative would be there'd be more of it tomorrow than there was yesterday. And it's not just in quantity, it's also in function. So when we're talking about soil, you can put your arms down.
Thank you.
When we're talking about soil, sure, we are building soil, but more in the short term, we're building function in soil. And so when we talk about regenerative ranching, the method of management we're doing is building soil. We're building this capacity, we're building this function, we're also building quantity of soil. And unfortunately in this region, because it was mostly a forest, when the early colonials came, there was a lot of, we could call that slash and burn farming. We would clear up the forest to plant the crops. And like I said earlier, forests, though we look at them and say they're really biodiverse and they have a lot of organic matter, it's only on the surface level. So that farmland that was cleared, 200 years ago, has pretty quickly been depleted. So the soils that we're farming on these days in this area are very much depleted. And so therefore the typical agriculture system needs a lot of inputs of fertilizer, of herbicide to fight what nature's trying to put back on the land. But our methodology, we can get into the science in a little bit of how we build that soil, but we are trying to build capacity into the land through the use of our livestock and the management of them to make these soils much more functional. And he was mentioning moving the cattle from paddock to paddock. We typically think of cows and sheep as beasts of burden, dull animals, but they are incredibly interesting to work with. They're very, very knowledgeable about the landscape in which they're in. We'll share some resources after this, but there is a book co-written by a gentleman named Fred Provenza. He was an animal behavioral researcher, and he spent time in Spain and France at these shepherding schools. And he wanted to learn how these shepherds are managing their sheep. And one piece of observation is that the sheep perform best and the landscape performs best when the shepherd walks them across the day as if it's like a progressive meal. So we're going to go to this area because of the biodiverse species here for their appetizer. It gets their stomach and rumen going. Then we're going to move them over here for the main course. Now they're really getting the food that they need because it's a different set of plant species. And then they bring them over here for the afternoon rest. They settle in, the body digests it, and then they get them up and move them in the afternoon. So there's a circuit. And the reason that he made that observation is that the animals know what they need. And if you have the right biodiversity available to them, they will go find specific plants that they need in their diet. Nutritionally, obviously flavor-wise, but nutritionally, they're seeking out what they need. And so if you give them if you step back and give them the opportunity, they show this high level of what we would call intelligence. They would call us dumb because we don't know what our bodies want. The closest is maybe like a pregnant woman. She'll have a craving. She'll crave pickles or ice cream, or I think that's the closest that we humans have where our body is telling us that we need something. But most of us are we don't know. We just eat what Brian cooks us, right? But if we give ourselves the opportunity to seek out that diverse food, we can really see some interesting nutritional components.
So more variety in your diet is the lesson, whether you're a sheep or a cow or a human and there's a lesson to be learned here, and this is an article that I'm going to be working on with the dietitian. So this is a slight segue, but we'll come back to where we were in a minute. This idea that, I want more healthier options on the menu, something we hear every day, right? The chef's comment book, more healthy options. And yet we make more healthy options, and what goes first? The unhealthy options, okay? So, we keep producing these healthy options, not that we're diminishing the plate of greasy stuff and fried foods, we're just offering more healthy options, but they end up getting, those are the things that aren't eaten. So somewhere, behaviorally, we know we want to eat better. And the perfect example, and I'm the perfect example, I'll go to the grocery store on Saturday and I'm going to buy these salads, I'm going to buy these greens, I'm going to go to Rockland's farm and see what great stuff he has on his shelves, and I'm going to get some steaks and I'll get a couple of fries, and what's gone at the end of the week? The steaks and the fries, and there's all that great produce that I, with all the best intentions, still sitting in the refrigerator. So it's a behavioral thing too, but getting in tune with this idea of, we have the intentionality, we have to follow through on it. So that's a segue, and you're going to be hearing more from me about that in the near future. But getting back to this idea of sensible, balanced grazing that's not only good for the animal but good for the land. One great example out of classic history, one of the few things I remember from my core studies and social studies at the University of Chicago was the early days of the Greeks. They had such lush land over the Greek islands in the earliest days when human settlements were being developed, and they grazed and they grazed and they grazed. I mean, the sheep grazed the land down to bare rock, and 5-6 times a year in its life cycle. And so there's a lot more energy turning over in a grassland ecosystem. Now the crux of why we can regenerate soil is when a grass plant is bitten
by an animal. They bite the first half of it. The plant says, okay, we've just been sheared, we need to regrow ourselves, right? So it's going to pull up some energy from its roots to then help the plant regrow and put out this giant solar panel to grow. While it's doing that, it is photosynthetically active. It is creating more energy to regrow. And what do we all do when we have too much energy in our diet? We store it, right? So if you eat too many donuts, you store it here. So these plants, their whole purpose is to grow, put up a seed, and like reproduce. And when they go into that stage of seeding out, they stop growing. So we are manipulating them by grazing to stay growing, to stay in their teenage years. And they're constantly growing. They're constantly bringing in CO2 for photosynthesis. And at times, they're creating excess energy. And they're storing that down in the roots. So carbon sequestration, carbon from the atmosphere into sugar, down into the soil in the form of organic matter is carbon sequestration. And by forcing these grasslands to stay productive like they were thousands of years ago, just like we're doing now with our animals, is essentially pumping carbon into the soil. And within a few decades, you start seeing their organic matter really start to grow because the grass is getting a big belly down in the soil and it's building that soil. So that's really the linchpin of the concept of regenerative ranching is manipulating photosynthesis for excessive carbon production that gets stored down in the soil. So that's what we're doing with our grazing.
And we're starting to see now some success in various countries. I have a friend who works for Lutheran World Relief in West Africa, and he's starting to see these farmers who are tearing up their fences and forming cooperatives to allow grazing. We've all become so possessive of our land. You go through suburbia and it's a puzzle of fences and my piece and my piece and my piece. But it's contrary to this concept of paddocks and rotation. So you're starting to see farmers come around to this concept of, I gotta let my neighbor graze on my land, and then I'll ultimately come around and graze on his land, or her land. And that way I'm returning to that best practice of a wider grazing range and allowing for that regenerative process to happen.
Yeah, and just to speak about water for a second, I don't know how much the group is focused on water issues around the world. So to give you a sense of scale, this room, if we were to triple this room, would be roughly an acre, maybe 4 times this room size. It would be 1 acre of land. So maybe the courtyard. I'll ask a question to you guys. How many gallons of water would accumulate in 1 acre, so 4 times this room? How many gallons could we collect if you had a 1-inch rain event? Just a nice gentle shower for an hour, 1 inch of rain. How many gallons would you suspect you'd collect from that? A gallon would be like a milk jug, right?
162.
162 gallons, 162 milk jugs if we have 1 inch of water across an acre. Any other guesses?
I don't think it's that high.
Oh, you think it's less than 100?
Yeah.
Okay, what would be your guess?
Probably, maybe quart, 100 quarts or something,
Okay.
whatever that would be,
Any other guesses?
Do you have to deduct what he said because some of it is so big?
No, no.
The net gain
Part of it, yeah.
If you were on a piece of concrete an acre wide, what you
that funneled into one thing.
10 gallons.
27,000 gallons in a 1 inch rain event on 1 acre. We have 43 to 45 inches of precip in the DC area on 1 acre. So just to give you a sense of scale, if you've ever driven on the highway and those big tanker trucks, the gasoline trucks that drive by, they're roughly about 10,000 gallons. So almost 3 tanker trucks per acre per inch of precip. And what's really interesting is 1% organic matter in the top few inches of topsoil, 1% organic matter has the capacity to hold roughly 27,000 gallons. And so most of the organic matter around here is maybe 2, maybe 3. So the soil has the capacity to hold the first 2 or 3 inches of rain in that rain event. If it gets more than that, it starts to flow off. Or if your soil is quite literally dead and fractured and it can't hold any water, it flows right off. So if anyone's been around in this area, the Save the Bay campaign, right? So the Chesapeake Bay, there's a massive watershed. There's a lot of water raining in this area, and water mobilizes through the soil mostly a lot of those nutrients down the waterway into the bay. And so you're losing water, you're losing nutrients, and you're losing soil, and it's going to a place where you don't want it, and it's leaving a place where you want it. So when we talk about regenerative grazing and building soil organic matter, if we can go to 5% organic matter, now we're talking about holding a hurricane's worth of precip at one time. And there's another lovely anecdote of a gentleman up in North Dakota. His name is Gabe Brown. He tells a story. We can share a video of him telling this story. There's a picture he has of his, it's kind of a fence line photo. So he has his field and his neighbor's field. And they had a 13-inch rain event, this massive, massive thunderstorm rain event. And his neighbor's field is just flooded, just absolutely flooded. And his field is not. His field looks like a field. He comes back 2 or 3 days later and takes another picture. His neighbor's field is dry as a bone and cracked. His field is not. So he's built up the organic matter in his field, and it's way more resilient to high precip events like flooding, as well as it still retains its moisture into drought-like conditions. And so you're talking about soil organic matter being this buffer to the climate.
And a bank.
And a bank, yeah. And so that's a lot of water. We go to places like Nevada, we would call that a desert. They might have 7 inches of precip, mostly in snowfall in the year, but that's still 7 inches per acre times 27,000 gallons. So when you're talking about these desertified areas that don't have that organic matter, all that water is just leaving.
This was in the news, this was today, this headlines today on NPR driving in is it Utah? The snowfall that was unusually, a huge snowfall, but the land now does not have the capacity to, and we know it's coming, it's gonna melt, but we don't have the land that can tolerate absorbing it. Meanwhile, they're irrigating these pistachio trees. Next time you go and you see a mountain of pistachio nuts at the grocery store, that is a lot of irrigation. And they're irrigating these pistachio nuts. Well, when this snow melts, it's going to wash away what little soil there is, and B, it's going to be gone when it's gone.
And there's really lovely engineering that we can do as humans. We can build dams and reservoirs, and what we're doing as ranchers is we're just raising cattle like they were created across a landscape and building soil. That's our form of bioengineering, is we're restoring these landscapes. And there's another documentary of these folks out west. Their water table on their ranch is moving uphill. So they've noticed over the past few decades that springs are starting to turn on further and further up these valleys because of their management. And so this concept of land regeneration through productive agriculture, I find quite compelling, and mostly because it's doable at scale. So we talk about organic vegetables, we talk about organic orchards or vineyards, and you're talking about tens, maybe hundreds of acres. When you get into crops like corn and soybeans, you might be talking about a few thousand acres. When you're talking about a ranch, With this philosophy out west, you're talking about 30,000 acres, 50,000 acres. I mean, there's million-acre ranches, and you're talking about areas the size of the DC metro area, like
It's a single ranch.
being managed in these ways that are restoring. And we're just talking about soil. We haven't talked anything about the migratory birds, the insects, the biodiversity, the local economy. There's so many other, like I said, threads that interact with that. But the linchpin is using cattle well. Now, when we take cattle out of that and put them in something like a feedlot,
Feed you Fritos.
so you're feeding them Fritos. We were talking earlier about the medications that they might need. And I'll say, I do know a number of ranchers that do feedlot, and they do it well, and the cattle are healthy. It's not this, it's not, it can
not
be done
Kansas.
okay. But generally speaking, you're taking them out of the ecosystem they're created to be in. You have to bring them food and take away waste, right? Because there's a lot of them never moving, you might have to add the medication component to that. But then the food that comes out of that you're receiving as a chef is different, right? They are eating a different diet and presenting you a different meat, culinarily wise, but also nutritionally, compared to what was raised on grass. So we think of like Argentinian barbecue being this lovely meat to work with. Well, it has been traditionally just all 100% pasture-raised, grass-fed, just out on the range. And so tell us a little bit about the difference in meat when you get a steak from a corn-raised or corn-finished versus a grass-fed, grass-finished.
We have about 12 minutes, and I do want to leave some time for questions, but this is exactly where I wanted to go right now with this conversation, which is how good we are. So you have this cow in a feedlot. You're raising corn in Iowa. You're on mega farms of corn. You have to do what to keep the corn, Monsanto's is doing whatever it needs to do to grow the high density corn. We don't want to even go into what it takes to grow that. We're taking that corn and shipping it to Kansas to feed these cows, this Fritos basically, these big bags of Iowa corn, and they're eating the corn. Well, what happens if you live on a diet of Fritos? I can tell you what happens to me. I mean, it's kind of self-evident. But you're eating it's a mono diet. You're not getting a variety of nutrients. You're getting a lot of fat and a lot of fiber. And you're always hearing about grain-fed, grain-finished, or corn-fed. Well, corn-fed beef, that's the American way. We are finishing our cows by being sedentary. You're not allowed to go to the gym. You're standing in a box, you're eating Fritos so that you gain this extra fat. And ideally, it's well marbled. I don't want to be well marbled, but that's
You wouldn't
what.
be killed either.
Yeah, I don't want to be, not necessarily, but that's where I'm going to end the conversation in a minute. But, the USDA measures prime, choice, and select, not by the quality of the quality of life that animal had, it's by how much fat is residing in the meat and how well distributed it is in the meat. So you have to kind of shift your paradigm to the grass-fed, grass-finished. They're athletes. They're walking around all day and night. They're eating a low-fat, high nutrient-dense diet. So the meat off of these cows is going to be low in fat, high in flavor, high dense energy. And any chef will tell you, the more muscle is used, the tougher it is, the more flavorful it is. So the ribeye, we all go for the ribeye, the New York strip from a pasture-raised, grass-fed, grass-finished cow, it's not your buttery, tender, eat it with a fork kind of beef experience. So don't expect that. And this is the thing I had to do with my students was say, okay, here's your buttery, tender ribeye, and here's grass-fed, grass-finished, pasture-raised ribeye. Be prepared to chew, but you're going to get much more flavor out of it. It's much better quality nutrient in that beef. If you're going to eat beef, this is the beef you want to eat, okay? It's a much better experience. If there's one change, one shift I can have you do in your own apartments, the one thing that one of the most lasting impressions my relationship with Greg has had on me is I only eat pasture-raised eggs now. If you get a pasture-raised egg and even the cage-free, chickens don't want to be cage-free. They like to commune together. But pasture-raised, they're getting a variety of things in their diet. They're getting sunlight. They're getting vitamin D in there by the process of being in the pasture. I want you to crack a pasture-raised egg next to a grocery store egg and just look at the difference. Without even cooking it, just look at the difference. And you'll see there's, the color and the density and the richness of this egg next to this sort of pale thing, so.
You just give me 1 minute. I have about 10 slides. The last slide is a video. I hope it can play. But this is my wife, Anna. These are beautiful flowers. She does dahlias in the fall. So she's a lovely flower garden. I hope this works. Oh, there we go. These are the boys harvesting grapes down in the vineyard. Oops. There's some more grapes in the bin.
What kind of looks?
I don't know exactly this variety. Maybe it's a Petit Verdot grape. So here's a picture of one of our pastures. Here's our sheep and our cattle moving together. This white line here is the electric fence. They have just gone into this pasture, so we're talking about going into grass. It's maybe 18 to 24 inches tall. It's a big, lush, you probably wouldn't like it because it doesn't look like a nice mowed lawn. It looks a little wild. But they're moving across that landscape. Here you go. Here's more of them moving. You can see the grass is kind of up. Most of it's to their belly, some of it's over their back. So that's some of the height that we're working with. This is some of the cover crop that we've been growing in part of our rotation of the pasture management, planting certain plants that are just highly active photosynthetically. That yellow thing is a shovel, just to show you height. So you're creating what you might look at as like a messy cornfield, but it's not corn. Here's another example. We came in and we mowed it. This one specifically, we don't have a fence on it yet. So we used the tractor like a cow to cut the grass to force it to keep regrowing. So this would be that shovel height. And we're mowing it not to your lawn of 2 inches. We're mowing it to 6 or 8 inches. This is a cow pie on the right.
No extra charge.
No extra charge. But a critical thing that we're doing is we are not working with synthetic chemistry with our livestock. They have not been touched with anything for years and years. But I wanted to show you what's next to the cow pie. Because of us removing these synthetical chemicals from our system, we are allowing the microbiology and the macrobiology just to proliferate. That's a worm casting. Worms dig through the soil. They bring all that soil from down below and they come up and they eat the bugs in the manure and they poop out their soil. So they bring up nutrients from deep. They take nutrients and take it back down. If you've ever seen worm castings, they're typically the size, they'll fit in a teaspoon. I mean, that's the size of a softball. The amount of biologic activity within the soil. Maybe, could you go back there and just press play? This is the video I wanted to show.
Do the chickens pick through there too, the manure?
Yeah, they can. We had our fourth daughter in 2019, winter of 2019. I also had a splenectomy. COVID hit. We kind of shed some of our enterprises. We used to do a bunch of chickens. We've kind of diminished that. But yeah, chickens would certainly pick through all that.
How long do you leave the herds in that field that we saw?
No more than a day.
No, they cleared in a
Yeah,
day?
starting now, it's usually within a day. There'll be that many head in 2 acres for a day. It's less about time and more about how much they eat. So we talk about grease. We go in like this and we leave when it's like this. We do not leave when it's like that. That would be terrible.
No go.
So we bring them to here, we move them, and then it regrows.
No.
Goats, sheep, cattle, doesn't matter. It's all about time. It's all about time. This is a ranch I visited in May of last year, the Birdwell Clark Ranch. It has a wonderful reputation. I think it got the Leopold Award recently. This is, they run on 15,000 acres. They run 6,000 head of cattle in one group. They move them every 3 days. But I just wanted Brian to look at this in terms of the quality of these animals. I mean, the finished quality that this meat would be. And these are 100% grass-fed, grass-finished, open-range cattle. 2 cowboys manage 6,000 head. The way that they move them, they don't have these little gates. They actually have these 8-foot-tall PVC posts, and they put it under the wire, and they just lift it up. So they can actually change where their entire rotation goes across the ranch. They don't have these heavy trailed areas. They can spread that impact across. And so they're leaving, it's hard to see as the camera moves around, but they're leaving in this ecosystem, which would be a well-grazed paddock, and they're going into the next paddock. And what they've done is they have created these 5 and 10 acre lakes, which then they can pump their water out to water the cattle. But what they've seen in their region of Texas is this incredible change, biodiversity, the quality of their forages. They've diminished the weed species and brought back other native species into desirables. The water system, we think of how much water comes across this landscape, that they're capturing it, their springs are coming back, and it's a closed loop system. When we go to the bathroom, we flush the toilet and it leaves our system. When the cattle go to the bathroom or drink water, it stays a part of their system. So anyways, I just want to give a sense of the scale of these and the quality of these animals, just in a grass-based system. So.
Well, we're very close to the end of the time that we're allotted, but clearly there's more to the story, and we're very enthusiastic about telling that story, so we hope to reprise this conversation. What we'd really like to do is run a field trip and go out and visit Rockland's farm and see this up close for ourselves, maybe taste a little of this local wine that he makes too. But in the minutes that we have left, if you have any questions.
And we will repeat the questions so the whole group can hear.
Okay, so,
Sure.
first of all, thank you, a really interesting presentation. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. Having explained the difference between different feeds for the cattle, what kind of beef are we getting here at Goodwin House?
How did I know that was going to come back around? You're seeing the marketplace. I'm going to try to not be evasive. We're seeing the market starting to change. We're starting to see best practices work its way into our commodities and become more affordable. Are we using commodity beef, from feedlots? I think what we're going to do is start taking a closer look and reporting that to you, because my job working for you here as your advocates is to lead with delicious and tell the story. So I will report to you. I will actually write on Touchdown or in the Gazette where our beef comes from and what we're eating and what our choices are. So I will give you that.
What challenges do dairies have?
So he asked, what challenges do dairy have? A little bit more, please. What?
Well, I mean, the dairy, the milk barn is here. So can they go to different fields as well?
Yeah, I understand. So he asked, what challenges do dairies have? So dairy cattle, right? And so there's a milk parlor. So they have this kind of hub and spoke geometry that they have. They can only go so far to eat grass to come back. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the milk that we're consuming is coming from these feedlot type dairies where they're bringing in forages. The medium and small scale dairies have a capacity to allow them to go out and to do grazing. There's a lovely field trip if you guys want to do it in Jefferson, Maryland, of a gentleman who's an all-grass dairy. But when we do human engineering to biologic systems, you're going to have trade-offs. And so specifically for dairies, there's only so far they can go to graze to then come back. And that scale contradicts the economies of scale of a large dairy. So they certainly have some challenges for that.
Yeah,
Speaking of dairy. I've often been curious about, I don't know if you can answer this or not, about the, with regard to land and water retention, the almond tree milk you get from almond trees versus the milk that you get from cows. You know, what is better environmentally for the land retention and water retention?
Yeah, so she asked what would be better for the land based on almonds versus cattle. It would be very hard to say. I would lean cattle just because I know that system more and what could be happening with the land, with their grazing or the feed inputs they're bringing. Whereas orchards tend to be a little more biologically lower functioning, if you will. It's just a tree with some grass that you mow below it. So I can't speak to that answer of what would be better or not.
I understand they use a lot of water.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the almond process is highly water intensive and doesn't necessarily give water back to the ecosystem in the way that a grazing system would. And so the almond milk, they take almonds, they grind them up and mix them with water to be almond milk, but almonds themselves would be pretty intensive agriculture.
think about where almonds are indigenous to, or what almond cultivation was most, occurred the most. And it's in these areas in North Africa and Middle East that have natural irrigations, very, highly arid, but with water systems. Well, we've turned Arizona into an oasis artificially with irrigation, and that's not sustainable.
So I'm going back to dairy.
Do
Yes,
you
ma'am.
do any farm to table? And when you put your article, I want to know how much of our food is farm to table.
Yeah, she asked if we do any farm to table. Yeah, we do a few farm to table meals where we showcase what we're doing, and our culture is, again, this table of welcome, this table of abundance. It's family style, kind of pass the pot kind of thing.
But
So-
are your animals going to certain specialty?
Accounts or.
I see. Yeah, so we're a pretty small operation. So we're processing like 60 head of beef a year, 200 and some lamb a year, and 5,000 cases of wine. All of that is being sold on site. So we're not at scale to be more in the wholesale world of moving, but there are a number of lovely ranches and ranch cooperatives that have been in the wholesale realm for quite a number of years.
And you're starting to see Virginia agriculture making its way more into the commodities that we're getting in grocery store. You go to the grocery store now, and there will be a whole aisle dedicated to locally raised, locally sourced. You go to the liquor store around the corner, the only wine the liquor store in Virginia is allowed to sell is wine produced in Virginia, which is another interesting story. But one of the best phrases, and I'm going to wrap this up, at least for my part, one of the best expressions or phrases that I learned from Chef Greg is the best thing you can do to start to shift your mindset, your behavior, your self-awareness and your awareness of your role in this story is shake the hand of the farmer that raises your food.
And just in closing, one thing that we really take seriously when we do our engagement is we feel that mostly what's needed in this world is a positive influence. And so we try to tell a story and present a message that is compelling versus convicting. So a lot of people are here thinking about their food choices, and oftentimes we hear, don't do this, feel bad about what you're doing, it's terrible. My message to anyone is to come as you are, to feel welcome to this table and to look through the lens of reverence and stewardship and how our food choices can represent our convictions. So my little phrase is eat your convictions. If you feel strongly about certain things, your food choices can really support that in a lovely way. And I hope that this is a message of compelling or joyfulness versus conviction. I'm not saying don't eat corn-fed beef. I'm not saying don't eat almond milk. What I'm saying is shake the hand of your farmer, shake the hand of your chef, get to know where your food comes from. Because that's a really lovely way to connect and make a difference in your life, the community you're within, and ultimately the region and the globe. So.
And in closing, second closing, one of the things that Greg said about this sense of coming to the table, we're ordering more round tables here to have more of a sense of communal engagement. That's one small step. The word companion, and I'll leave it here, the word companion, the Greek, the Latin root words, companion, the one with whom you break bread. So our true companionship begins and ends with the story of how we share food together. So, thank you, Greg, for coming out today. So much appreciated. Hopefully you're not caught up in the traffic on the way home. So thank you all very, very much, and happy Earth Day tomorrow.
Amen.